But first to a really big story tonight, and this is going to be a major story in the Australian newspaper tomorrow. It's the issue of Chinese Communist Party interference in Australian universities. Now, we all know this is a major problem, and we've seen a host of examples recently to know that we should be taking this seriously. Drew Pavlou is just the latest, the UNSW issue last week as well. But what I'm about to tell you now will show you just how deep and how significant this problem really is, and how it's a web that will be very difficult to untangle. And unfortunately, the Morrison government, as strong as it's been on this issue of foreign interference, has no idea of the depth of the problem it's dealing with. Tonight, I can reveal that the Chinese government is actively recruiting Australian academics to a secretive research program called the 1,000 Talents Plan. This program offers, very often, lucrative salaries and perks. Sometimes there's even tuition for their children, jobs for their spouses, international travel, and they can even get housing subsidies. But there's a catch. It also requires inventions to be patented in China, and it obliges by the academics to abide by Chinese law and religious practices. Here are some of the clauses in the contracts that academics have signed with an affiliated Chinese university under this 1,000 Talents Plan. The contracts state, intellectual property rights, including copyright, patent rights, trademark rights, are owned by the Chinese institution. It reiterates that the Chinese institution under the 1,000 Talents Plan owns the copyrights of the works, inventions, patents, and other intellectual properties produced by Party B during the contract period. The contracts usually have a clause that state that the academic is required not to disclose the contract to unrelated parties without consent. So they very often have to keep their participation in the 1,000 Talents Plan quiet or a secret. Many contracts, extraordinarily, extend the rules beyond law into the area of religious practices. Here's one clause in a contract, and I quote, Party B shall respect China's religious policies and shall not conduct any religious activities incompatible with his or her status as a foreign expert. It also tells academics that they, and I quote again from the contract, that they shall observe relevant laws and regulations of the People's Republic of China and shall not interfere in China's internal affairs. Now, under the 1,000 Talents Plan, to the best of our knowledge, the Chinese government has managed to recruit about 7,000 people globally. They use these programs to gain access to technology through covert, illegal, or non-transparent means. This is what experts say. And the experts, like Alex Josky, who's an analyst at AUST, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, he's going to join me in just a moment. He's the foremost expert on this issue in Australia. He says that the 1,000 Talents Plan and others like it have been associated with intellectual property theft or espionage and can also contribute to the PLA, the People's Liberation Army's military modernisation. He says, Josky argues that the scale of China's recruitment programs is what sets it apart from other foreign talent plans. I mean, this program operates almost entirely in the shadows. Here's FBI Director Christopher Wray outlining just what a serious threat this foreign recruitment program is in a speech he gave in July 2020, just a month ago. He said, through talent recruitment programs, China pays scientists at American universities to secretly bring our knowledge and innovation back to China, including valuable federally funded research. He says, to put it bluntly, this means American taxpayers are effectively footing the bill for China's own technological development. China then leverages its ill-gotten gains to undercut US research institutions and companies, blunting our nation's advancement and costing American jobs. He says we are seeing more and more of these cases. He then went on in this speech, as I say, just in July this year to the Hudson Institute. He went on to describe recent cases. In May, the FBI arrested Qing Wang, a former researcher with the Cleveland Clinic, who worked on molecular medicine and the genetics of cardiovascular disease. That same month, just May this year, the FBI also arrested Simon Saw-Tong An, a University of Arkansas scientist doing research for NASA. Christopher Wray said, and hopefully we can bring you this audio in a minute. Okay, we're not getting that audio. I'll read you his quote. He said both of these guys were allegedly committing fraud by concealing their participation in Chinese talent recruitment programs while accepting millions of dollars in American federal grant funding. Now, the most famous case in the US has been Harvard's Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology professor, Charles Lieber. He was head of that department for Harvard University. He was indicted in June for lying about his participation in the plan, the Thousand Talents Plan. He concealed that he was actually also a senior scientist at a Chinese university and didn't disclose to anyone the fact that the Chinese government was paying him $50,000 a month, plus more than $150,000 in living expenses, and he had a $1.5 million grant to set up a laboratory in China. All the while, he was at Harvard being paid by the United States university and funding. Now, Peter Jennings, who's the executive director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, he said President Xi Jinping's civil-military fusion is where the concern lies, because it means that the Thousand Talents Plan can help China develop weapons and advance its military, even if the academics aren't aware that that is the end goal. Have a listen.
A lot of this work is essentially being militarised by Xi Jinping, taking the work of Chinese institutions and applying it to the interests of the People's Liberation Army and China's intelligence services. So what was perhaps acceptable in the 90s and early 2000s now becomes a big strategic problem in the 2020s because of how China is treating those researchers and using that research information.
It's also a clear form of intellectual property theft where China can make money from research funded by Western governments.
But, you know, what is happening is the wholesale vacuuming up of intellectual property at Australian universities and across the democracies. And, you know, this is something that we're now going to have to stop when you step back and take a look at the nature of the state that we're dealing with in the People's Republic of China.
The Department of Home Affairs says it's working closely with the university sector after releasing guidelines for foreign interference last year. Home Affairs gave me this statement of the Thousand Talents program and the risk it poses to universities. They say international research collaboration is vitally important to Australia. It gives us access to the best researchers in the world, but this is carefully balanced against Australia's national interests, including our national security, our values and ethical standards. Home Affairs says it is critical that the work of Australian researchers is not undermined by foreign interference and activities that put our universities, our people, information and intellectual property and data at risk. The guidelines assist the universities to take a proportionate risk-managed approach to counter foreign interference while maintaining the freedom universities need to pursue groundbreaking research. As you can see, what the academics and scientists are doing is not against any rule or law. Instead, the Morrison government and Peter Dutton in Home Affairs and Dan Tehan in Education are relying on the universities following guidelines to protect our national security. Guidelines. Clearly, this is not good enough. Here's how many investigations are going on in the United States.
These cases were among more than 1,000 investigations the FBI has into China's actual and attempted theft of American technology. And that's not even talking about the more than 1,000 other ongoing counterintelligence investigations of other kinds related to China. We're conducting these kinds of investigations in all 56 of our field offices. And over the past decade, we've seen economic espionage cases with a link to China increase by approximately 1,300%. The stakes could not be higher, and the potential economic harm to American businesses and the economy as a whole almost defies calculation.
When we approached every single university for our big story in the Australian newspaper tomorrow, when we approached them to ask how many thousand talent recruits they had in their employ, mostly they couldn't answer. If the universities themselves don't know how many Thousand Talents Plan or other Chinese government recruitment program recipients they have in their employ, there is no way the Australian government has the oversight of how many academics and scientists have been recruited to enable them to deal with this. And this is where the work of journalists come in. Tomorrow, in The Australian, we will name 30 academics in Australia who have been recruited to the Chinese government's Thousand Talents Plan or another similar Chinese government foreign recruitment program. In the Australian Tomorrow, we are naming them. Some have been registering their intellectual property in China. There's a lot to read on this and a lot to talk about it, so make sure you do not miss the report tomorrow.